to Your Financial Legacy podcast. I am your host, Maria Ellis. On every episode, I will bring you my perspective and the perspective of my guest on financial planning and estate planning topics. Here at the Financial Legacy podcast, we are changing lives one person at a time. To help you create a financial plan that will lead you to success, connect with us at financiallegacy.live for your complimentary consultation. Today, we're having a special guest, a real estate attorney, Lynn Figman. Lynn specializes in doing both residential as well as commercial real estate. And we are extremely lucky today because not only is she going to be addressing you as a potential seller, but also you as a potential buyer, and also we'll be talking about the current market conditions, both of residential as well as commercial. So we're going to be doing 3 consecutive episodes. I hope you could join us in all of them. So for now, please help me welcome Lynn Figman. Lynn, welcome to the show.
Hi, Maria. It's always wonderful to see you and talk to you. You're a shining beacon for me, especially in these dark times.
Oh, yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Thank you for that, by the way. So tell us a little bit about your real estate practice. Why did you become interested in that side of the law versus other aspects of, corporate environment?
Sure. Well, I've certainly had a long time to think about this question, given that I started practicing in 1985. And unfortunately, laws become so specialized that, truthfully, what you do in your first few years will, in large part, dictate your career specialty. So I went to law school in New Jersey, right over the river from New York, and I graduated in 1984. And at that time, New York was undergoing a tremendous real estate renaissance. I had taken a course my last year of law school that was taught by a practicing attorney who gave us a real life transaction as our semester-long project, which was conveyancing a commercial building in New York City. And we started, it was almost like an apprenticeship. And we started from the letter of intent and working with the brokers like yourself, the experts at the outset, giving us the terms, and it went all the way to closing and what we call the topping off party, which is, if there's some construction, everybody gets invited, they go to the top of the roof, and they have a drink, and the deal is done. And the truth is that based on that, I realized if I were going to even practice law, it would have to be real estate because it involved something tangible to me. I could see the dirt, and I could see the buildings, and I could see the operation of those buildings. If it was multi-family, I could see people actually living and working, and it was something that was almost like being a contractor in putting the legal components together, as opposed to more of the esoteric and what some lawyers will tell you who are not real estate lawyers, intellectual parts of lawyering, which were cases and filings and arguing in court. So the truth is it dovetailed my interest in what we call dirt law and the real estate market of New York that was starting to come back from the ashes of the 1970s. And I haven't looked back.
Wow. So you bring a wealth of experience to our listeners today. So let's say we're in a scenario where a seller, person is considered to sell a property, a real estate property here in New York, let's say in the residential side. And let's assume that at this point they have a few offers, and at some point they're going to be hiring you to represent you in the sale of that property. Tell us, what is the process when you get together with that seller? What are some of your major concerns?
I might have missed, did you say what type of property? Because that's
we're looking
at
residential, and
Okay.
we're addressing a seller.
Sure. So, as Maria well knows, there are lots of residential types of property in New York, and I believe that's the biggest learning curve for a new investor in New York real estate. We have something called co-ops, cooperative apartments. We have condominiums. We have freestanding houses. We have freestanding buildings. We have freestanding warehouses that actually have been converted into residentials. And of course, New York being ever creative, and particularly its real estate market over the last 30 years, there are all sorts of iterations of residential that time, Maria, will probably not permit us in this section to go into. But what comes to mind, and you could talk to this more specifically, are condops, which is a combination of co-ops and condominiums. And I think it's unique. It's a hybrid, and there are many, many hybrids. So let's talk about what the most common is, particularly to new investors in the city looking for residential, and that would be the individual condominium. How it starts is a top flight broker, such as Maria, will have spent many, many months searching for the proper property, condominium, whether it be in Manhattan or Brooklyn, the Bronx, or in some of the surrounding counties of New York City, and try and put together a deal. So the most important cog in the very beginning is the broker who will negotiate the terms, and it goes down on something called a term sheet. A potential client will call me and say, and usually they call too late, and it causes me a lot of angst to sort of, I like to know when someone is looking for property, because otherwise we have to, if we have an accepted offer, we've got to turn around a contract within a day usually. And I can go into the legal ramifications of that maybe in our next section. So where I come in is the broker has brokered the deal, has gotten both parties to agree to the terms, has put together something called a term sheet. Some are robust, which include every little detail. Some include the purchase price, the address, and the parties. And again, as a lawyer, when I get a more robust term sheet, it makes my job easier, because the next stage, which is negotiating the contract with the lawyer for the other side, it makes it a lot easier. We have less things to argue over, if you will. And then we proceed
from the
lawyer
for the other side will be your conversation with the buyer's lawyer.
Yes, buyers or sellers, depending on
in this case,
who we're representing, right?
Yeah.
Right. And that is something which is what we call old school New York, because most jurisdictions now in the United States, including surrounding states such as New Jersey, allow the brokers to enter into the initial contract, and the lawyers really don't sort of move into action until after the contract is signed. But in New York, you need to bring the lawyer in from the get-go as early as possible, as I said, when you're looking, and that's why it's a pleasure, Maria, to work with you, because you will say, I have a client and we're looking for properties. And, if in fact I become the attorney in that deal, I already have opened my file, might be able to, run a conflicts check, may know a little bit of what your client is looking for, because there are many, many kind of condominium contracts.
Right.
So it helps the lawyer to prepare and be ready to go. And frankly, if I'm on vacation when the deal closes, or I'm sorry, not closes, but comes to fruition, a contract is circulated, I always have backup. And that's how fast it is in New York, because if you don't act, on the spot, in responding to the other attorney or in getting the contract out to the other attorney, depending on which side of the table you are in the deal, the client can lose lose the deal.
Absolutely.
So it's a very quick process
yeah,
for a lawyer
as
to
a
act
point of
in New York.
yeah, as a point of illustration, Lynn, because of the current market is really a buyer's market. We are now, some of the buyers are making 2 or 3 offers, and we have had situations just recently where we thought we had a transaction. I represented the seller. We thought we had a transaction, and then because we didn't have a signed contract, the deal just went away because they negotiated lower prices with other. These were, your typical investors that were not necessarily that doesn't necessarily love the location or the apartment, but it's more of a transaction basis. So yeah. So it's important absolutely for you to be brought into the deal as soon as possible, because time is of the essence, I think, at that point.
Right, which is why the team, which I think you're going to probably talk to later, the team of broker and lawyer and title
Yes.
and etc. It's very important to have people that not only work together, but people who are sensitive to the timing of a real estate deal in New York.
Right. Sorry for interrupting. That has been a recent experience with me, so I'm sort of better with the sellers right now.
Well, I always learn from talking to you, Maria, because again, lawyers, to bring my role in again, is we're always the last to know. Okay, and it's sort of a joke, but it's true, and we really rely on you to tell us what you're up to, what it's like out there in the market, in the trenches. Because I'm not involved in the marketing of real estate. I'm not there showing properties. I'm sitting behind a desk, moving commas and negotiating on paper. You, on the other hand, know the market and know the speed that's required to secure a deal.
Yeah, because we have had situations where even after a contract has been signed, tell us in your experience, hopefully not that many, but once a contract is fully executed and a buyer decides to, rescind the contract, you representing the seller, what will you be doing at that point?
Well, when you say rescind, that is a loaded legal word. The contract, once it is signed, will govern how the rescission of the contract goes. And again, that's where the importance of very particular lawyering goes in. So I have not had, fortunately, many deals that have, fallen after contract signing. I'll just give you the 2 extremes, which is the buyer decides for whatever reason to walk away. And there are many, many reasons that they might justify for walking away. In most cases in New York, the contract will provide, if they walk away for almost any reason, they will forfeit the deposit money, the contract deposit money that they paid when they signed the contract. Now, there are buyers' attorneys who will anticipate this. And again, at the outset in the contract will say that for 1, 2, and 3 reasons, the buyer can rescind the contract and get their deposit money back. So, unfortunately, there are lawyers who don't provide for that inevitability, and sadly, they have to tell their client that the contract deposit will be forfeited to the seller, and the seller can move on and sell the property to somebody else. Usually those cases end up in court.
Yeah, and a sale contract is so complex. I mean, there's lots of clauses. So tell us a little bit about what are some of the most important clauses that should be included in the contract as you representing the seller.
Okay, well, of course, there are the basic terms, which again, we come back to the initial term sheet, which the broker will put together, which names the parties, which names the purchase price, which obviously names the premises, which will include a legal description of the premises, will include the financing provisions. And that we might want to speak to a little bit later, Maria, because that is probably in a condominium residential where there's a mortgage to be had by the buyer, or to be sought, I should say, by the buyer. The financing contingency in the contract is probably the most important provision and the most highly negotiated, frankly. Also, of course, the personal property, as we call it, that is going to be included in the sale. It has to be very, very specific. The standard form contract will, of course, say that the windows or the refrigerator, the kitchen equipment that is attached to the walls, all are included in the sale. But believe it or not, many conflicts that I've had on the morning of closing are because the parties weren't clear on what, in fact, was included in the sale in terms of personal property and wasn't. And if we have time, I can tell you my initial experience in this, which involved a sconce on a wall.
Right.
Where two very high net worth and public figures, one was selling the condo to the other, and everything was smooth sailing, etc., until at the closing table, the representative for the seller said to the representative for the buyer, do you mind if we come in? We're going to be removing the sconce later today. So before the buyer moves in, everything is ready except we need to get that sconce off the wall. Buyer's representative said, what do you mean? Isn't that sconce included in the sale? Seller said, absolutely not. Lawyers look at the contract. There was no mention of a sconce. So now the question is a sconce affixed to the wall so that it's part of the property? Or is it a decorative item, such as a painting, that is not included in the sale? And this has come up at other times. Sometimes it comes up because that sconce is worth a lot of money. But most times, if it comes up, it's because it's something of personal value.
Yeah, sentimental value, right?
Sentimental value. And yet a buyer will dig in, even if it has no sentimental value, and say, well, when the broker showed me the apartment, it was on the wall. Nobody told me that it was not included in the sale, and I want out. And they use it. And I have to say that I've never had one of those deals, including the expensive sconce, between the two famous people. I've never had the deal break because of that, but I have had closings go on, sometimes for days, and have to be adjourned until the parties can somehow leverage their positions. So they sell the sconce, they take the sconce, they lower the purchase price, and that's where the brokers have to jump back in. And take most of the heat, quite honestly.
Right, because it wasn't included in the term sheet. It should have been included to begin with. So I think that, the term sheet, again, going back to your original comment, that is very important. A situation that I have similar to that was beautiful chandeliers. I had not really a lot of monetary value, but it did have, sentimental value to this particular seller. So that was interesting.
And then other people, this being New York, try to use that as leverage.
They negotiate, and then, the buyer gets credit or whatever, the seller gets credit depending on what side of the table you're in. So that's interesting. So you were talking about financing. We'll probably, discuss that when we talk about what should buyers be concerned with. But financing is also important to the seller, and very important to the broker, because depending if you're showing, for instance, an apartment in a condo that might require 10 or 20% down, versus if you're showing in a co-op, that some co-ops require 40-50% down. So
and these days it may be getting more, is that right?
Right, yeah. So anyway, so we'll talk about that. So tell us what it's. I know that most of your cases, or probably all of your cases, closed. But what have been some cases that you know of that there has been an issue and people just parties have just decided not to just continue to do their transaction? Have you had a situation like that?
Yes, where the buyer and the seller, circumstances change.
Right, yeah, because
And
in some situations it goes pretty smooth, and maybe there are some minor issues, but they get resolved at the closing table, while others is just very challenging situations.
yes, well, the perfect situation is when the party who wants to break the contract, as it's called, unless it's particularly, as I said, set forth in the contract that they have the right to break the contract.
Right,
If it isn't set forth, the best situation is where you have what you brokers would call a hot market, where a seller might say, okay, I'm going to let you off the hook for X number of dollars, etc., because the market has changed a bit, perhaps, since they
right,
initially entered the contract, and they know that there's a line of people waiting to buy their property, and they might welcome the fact that the buyer is no longer interested. Um, and that is the best scenario.
right.
Which is not the scenario we have right now.
It is
We
not
have
at
a lot of
all.
no. I have to say that in 35 years of practicing real estate law, through boom and bust and all the ups and downs that most investors in New York can follow easily now on social media and mainstream media, and by talking to you who pores over the kind of reports that the average person doesn't have access to. This is the most unique situation, because it is not a business situation. It's a social pandemic as well,
Right,
involving families and schools and jobs, and how technology has changed that. So in New York real estate right now, in terms of breaking contracts, etc., we are seeing reasons that are being put forth primarily based on COVID, uh, for buyers backing out of deals, or for sellers who backing out of contracts because they can no longer afford to move,
right,
or yeah. So it's and because the courts are primarily closed still, there's a huge backlog of cases. And so what I advise, I don't do litigation. I do work with litigators and tax attorneys and all of that. But New York being as specialized as it is, when we get into one of these situations where someone wants to walk away and it wasn't provided for in the contract, and COVID is the reason, I say, listen, let's talk it through, because if you are going to go into court, the courts are so backlogged, you
right.
probably will not get a termination for 2 years at least, which, as you know, in real estate years, Maria, is a whole nother era.
Right, exactly, exactly.
So
So,
COVID has changed everything, and truthfully, real estate lawyers are dealing with clients who are finding themselves in positions that they never thought they'd be in, on both sides of the table, seller and
yeah,
buyer.
yeah, COVID 2020 has been a very challenging year
Yeah,
because of COVID.
yeah,
So I put that as a reference for people who may listen to this 5 years from now or whatever, so they know what we were living through. And,
yes.
started in the spring, summer, and now fall of 2020. You mentioned earlier that in a situation where the seller can no longer afford to move out of the apartment. I have seen that recently because some sellers, let's say elderly people or people who want to move out of the city and then decide to buy it outside New York City. The problem is that although Manhattan prices have come down, prices in the outskirts, in the suburbs, have really gone up, and I'm seeing contracts that are going 10, 15% over ask outside New York City. So
Yeah.
it's really an amazing dichotomy there. Manhattan used to be the place to be. Everybody wants to be in Manhattan with all of the beautiful things that it has to offer. But we're hoping that, of course, that a vaccine is going to come. And we were doing sort of a poll about this past summer with some of the members of the Harvard Business School globally. And many of them said situations are not going to change until, the fall of 2021 because of the time lag that it takes. And that's been optimistic in terms of actually getting a vaccine that actually works. So, since this is a podcast on sellers, these are really very challenging times, and you have to get together with your agent that represents you to find out whether or not, what's important to you, why you're moving, what are some of your choices, what is the minimum price that you want to take, and what is the competitive price, and do you owe any money? Could you refinance if you're needing money? Just there are many other alternatives other than just selling your apartment. So,
yeah, what do you suggest to those sellers as alternatives? Because there are things such as leases, which
exactly
I'm seeing a lot of, frankly.
Yeah. On the other hand, the market, as you know, in Manhattan really varies. If you're looking at the Upper East Side or the Upper West Side or the financial district, they vary in price per square footage versus if you are in a co-op or a condominium, whether you have amenities. So there are many variables involved, with pricing. But ask me the question again. I went into a tangent there.
Well, sellers, real estate lends itself to going into tangents when you talk about it in New York in the best of times.
Yeah.
And now everything's so topsy-turvy. So, you're forgiven. But I learn the most when people sort of go off on tangents.
So tell me the question again.
So my question, you talked about, sellers who may no longer be in the position to sell, or they're trying to decide if they should sell, and they're trying to, as we call it, game the market, or as they say in the stock market, marked market. Are they, what's going to happen in September? Should I wait to sell? Is the market going to be better? This is the biggest game in residential real estate in New York since the first piece of property here was developed. And an alternative that I'm seeing a lot more is where sellers are leasing their properties.
Yes, they're leasing the properties. However, the leasing market has come down even further than the actual sale market. And the reason for that is because a lot of developers who have had excess inventory that they have built and they were thinking about selling, but as the prices come down and they have loans, with institutions that don't allow them to have, that they are required to have certain ratios and certain price levels, they decide to instead lease those apartments. And they're offered 2-3 months free rent, which brings in the price down. So a small unit owner, you cannot compete really. They either have to lower the price or give amenities. So if you have to sell, if you as a seller are selling because you need cash to live, and you have purchased, let's say, that property a few years back, and you may have equity into the building, the best thing to do is actually get an equity line of credit to help you through that process. Because if you were to sell your property, you'll have to come down on price. But there are many variables. For instance, some people are tired of New York and they just want to go to Florida, because there are lower taxes or whatever, nicer weather. So it's really very personal. The choice is very personal, depending on the circumstances and whatnot.
Right.
But at least, leasing is another alternative. But the prices have in fact come down. So some of my clients who are currently, tenants in the building, at midstream are actually negotiating. They say they have a 2-year contract and they've been in the building just for 6 months. They're coming back and say, hey, the prices are now, 20% down. I'd like to get a discount or I'm moving out. of course, they have the issue of, they cannot break the lease and again go into court and whatnot. So, tenants and landlords decide to compromise and come up to some sort of agreement.
I'd like to jump in on that from a legal perspective if we
Yes.
have a moment. I don't know where we are on time.
Yes. We have a few more minutes, and then I have one final question. And then we'll go into what you buy. I said I'll have a unique question after this, and then we'll close. Yeah.
No, I'm not selling the apartment that you're seeing behind me as I work from home. So if that's your unique question, although for the right price,
yes,
you never know.
There's always something to negotiate.
Exactly. Spoken like a true broker and advisor. My comment on leases is very simple. And Maria, you and I had a situation with a lease, I believe, about a year and a half ago at this point. What investors who might be new to the New York market don't realize, or landlords or tenants or buyers or sellers, is that the lease, in many cases, is as important as a contract of sale. And I do a lot of leases. It is not simply a form. And I think, Maria, perhaps I've educated you on this. Many brokers believe that they can get a form off of the system and there's the lease or there's the sublease, when in fact they should bring a lawyer in. It's worth it at the very beginning to negotiate the terms of that lease. Right. And in that way, you can help the seller because you can talk about, well, after 6 months, the lease goes up to this. And if you break the lease, here's the penalty, etc. So you can craft a lease provided you, before it's signed or amended, I might add, you can amend contracts of sale, you can amend leases, which is right. Something very important for clients to understand. It's not always set in stone. It's the same thing. You bring two parties together, they can negotiate it. The lawyer with the broker, with the financial advisor perhaps, and then the lawyer puts it, and it's a whole new amended document that is right. will supersede the prior contract or the lease. So lease and contract of sale is where the real estate lawyer can be very helpful, provided that they're brought in before anything is signed and before money is exchanged.
Absolutely. And the same goes to lease extensions, as an example. Now, as prices come down, I'm having clients that I have an example, the Trump Towers, how the prices have come down throughout Manhattan, really. But my particular client happens to be in that building. And it's now we're having like 30% down, reduction. So the seller is considering just doing a little bit of an extension other than the whole 1-year renewal, because we're hoping that the market is going to change. It's coming up in June 2021. So there are different strategies, but absolutely the presence, the guidance of an attorney like yourself is critical, especially in these difficult times. So I'd like to close by asking you one question, and that is, if you had not
I've heard you say that before, Maria. I have heard you say it before. But we have an audience now.
Yeah, if you have not chosen to be a real estate attorney, what other career you have chosen? What interests you?
Well, I never intended on going to law school. I would be a sportscaster. And in fact, a little known fact you might not know about me is that during college, I was the first woman to call play-by-play and color commentary on the radio of big college Division I football, basketball, and baseball.
Wow.
And I worked part-time for what was then, it was the progenitor of cable TV, called pay TV. Yes. And I did, yes, and on pay TV, there was a women's professional basketball league, which again was the progenitor of the current WNBA. And they played at Queens College, the New York team did. And yes. So I called women's basketball games on pay TV. So that was the career path that I was headed in. I was a little before my time.
Yes.
I did work for a year before I went to law school, and went to law school on a scholarship on a lark. almost a bet. And then it actually interested me while I was there, and I gave up on the sportscasting dreams. And then women, of course, became more common in the media, in the sports world. And but I think I missed my time by about 15 years, I would say.
Interesting.
So that's the answer.
Yeah. Interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
My
Again,
pleasure.
I would like to thank you, for tuning into with me and our special guest, real estate attorney in New York City, Lynn Figman. To learn more about me and Lynn, go to the financiallegacy.life for a complimentary consultation. Here at the financiallegacy.life, we help you create your financial plan and help you create your financial legacy. So contact us at financiallegacy.life for your complimentary consultation. And thanks again for being with us today. Thanks, Lynn.
My pleasure.